Are we only half alive? Embers drifting in the night, looking, wandering all the time. We seek a kingdom. This is not my home. This skin and bone. The daylight will reconcile the dead and the gone. Let the kingdom come.
Hi, I'm Robert Beatty with the How Free Do You Want to Be series. Thank you for joining me, my friends. This is going to be a life-changing adventure for you. If you were diagnosed with a life-threatening disease today, would you just accept the idea that you must live with the diagnosis? Or would you research and educate yourself, get a second opinion, seek treatment? Would you seek a cure? Well, then why is addiction and mental illness any different? And why would you believe that they're not curable? Everyone's burdens in life are different. What's a life crisis for one person, another one might call nothing at all. And others experience more trauma, anxiety, depression, suffering, and health issues than anyone could ever imagine. We all have our crosses to bear, as they like to say. Maybe what separates us is the weight and the size of it and how far up the hill you've got to haul it. Well, these crosses often involve mental illness of one type or another, but these issues can be healed. In fact, they can be cured. And the truth is, we're all addicted to something, aren't we? It might not be alcohol or drugs, could be sex, could be gambling, pornography, playing video games, working out, eating, shopping, hoarding, cleaning, even pain and suffering. That list goes on ad infinitum. In 1939, the first edition of Alcoholics Anonymous was published, and the world started to learn about the success of the methods that the authors back then called the 12 Steps. The 12 Steps, as they were written, were hard to understand. They were confusing, mostly because of the era in which they were written. The program has worked for millions and millions of men and women since 1939. It worked for me too. It worked for the man who led me through these steps and the man who led him through them. They worked for all of us, and they'll work for you too. This program answers the following questions very clearly. Is there a cure for addiction? Is there a cure for depression and anxiety? Is there a cure for mental health disorders in general? Does God exist? Is there a higher power? Do prayers get answered? And what does it take to have a spiritual awakening that creates a change in the way that we think? The steps found in this program can be used to overcome just about anything in your life once you understand them. It's a simple, proven plan of action that's found within them and a promise that will set you free. Free from addiction, free from suffering, free from the struggles of your life. When you complete the steps as they're outlined in this program, you're going to find a few things: serenity, freedom, and peace. As millions and millions of men and women before you have, this series will guide you through the same spiritual awakening that I had. It will cause a change in the way that you think. I want to give you a brief history on myself before we begin. I have personal knowledge of the pain and suffering and the destruction that's caused by addiction and mental illness. I have my own story. A story of spiritual awakening, of redemption, and a journey to a full recovery from mental illness, from alcoholism, and from addiction. We'll cover this later in the series. I ask you to just have an open mind and have an open heart. And if you'll do this, I promise you one thing, my friends. I promise you that this program will work for you, and it will change your life. I'd like to give you a history on mental health and addiction. Mental health issues were recorded as far back as 1900 BC. And around 400 BC, a Greek physician named Hippocrates identified the different levels of mental and physical health. And for the first time in history, he endeavored to separate religion from superstition, from health and well-being. And he also believed that mental illness was something that you should be ashamed of and that you should be punished for. Well, thankfully, a lot has changed since then. Alcoholism and addiction were recorded as far back as 7000 BC, when the Chinese were fermenting beverages, along with many other mind-altering substances. In fact, in our society, alcohol and drugs have always been at the root of all illegal activities, problems, and several mental disorders. The Volstead Act, or Prohibition, passed by the United States Congress in 1919. The act made the distillation, sale, and distribution and transportation of alcohol illegal, but not its consumption. And for the next 13 years, the American people proved that not even the law could keep them from a drink. Not only would they continue to use alcohol, but they would profit from it via the black market. So despite attempts by authorities to control alcohol, the problem was out of control. As one establishment was raided and closed down, another one would pop up in its place. The illegal use of alcohol fueled gangsters, moonshiners, and organized crime, and to add to this growing problem, the Italian mafia started to distribute heroin and cocaine. The ever-increasing issues associated with the illegal distribution of drugs eventually led to the national prohibition of cocaine. With the passing of the Dangerous Drug Act of 1920, and before this period, it was regulated by the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. This act made the sale and distribution of heroin legal for medical purposes only, and only with a doctor's prescription. But in 1924, new laws made heroin an illegal substance as well. During Prohibition, medical doctors even began to prescribe alcohol as a way around Prohibition. And at one time, over 1 million gallons of alcohol were prescribed per year. When Prohibition was repealed in 1933, approximately 15 to 20 million Americans suffered from alcoholism. Wow! Now, in our history, there's always been people across the spectrum, those that could drink moderately, those that could take it or leave it alone, and then the hard drinkers and those that just couldn't stop no matter what. Medical professionals and scientists have never really been sure about the cause of alcoholism, or addiction for that matter. We have identified specific things that lead to it, such as family history and drinking for long periods of time. Mental health, anxiety, depression, social acceptance, just to name a few. However, not everyone with these issues becomes an alcoholic. In the past, alcoholism and addiction were perceived as character flaws, a conscious decision by someone with no morals or honesty or control by normal society standards. And so sufferers were stigmatized. Well, thankfully, all that's changed over the years, and particularly since the medical profession came forward years ago and publicly declared alcoholism and addiction as diseases. Since then, treatment has evolved substantially. Alcohol rehabilitation started as early as 1750, when groups of Native Americans formed society circles to help members of their community to stay sober. More than 100 years later, in 1879, there was a doctor named Leslie Keeley who labeled drunkenness a legitimate medical disease, and he claimed that he could cure it with injections of chloride of gold, or gold and chlorine. Keeley's operations at that time may have been the earliest makings of what we now know as residential inpatient treatment centers. However, in our history of alcoholism, two individuals stand out: Bill Wilson, or Bill W., and Dr. Robert Holbrook Smith, or Dr. Bob. These guys came together in 1935 to form what is now known as Alcoholics Anonymous, or AA. And they were passionate about their cause because they were both desperate to stop drinking. Shortly after Bill W. became sober, he helped Dr. Bob stop drinking too. And soon afterwards, Alcoholics Anonymous was formed. Their initial plan was to work with alcoholics in the Akron City, Ohio hospital. And for the first time, the only people in these groups were Dr. Bob and Bill W. and a mutual friend named Evie T., or Evie Thatcher. These early pioneers also began writing a guidebook about how to become sober. In 1939, they published the first edition of Alcoholics Anonymous. Before this time, hospitalization and mental wards were the only answer. Many doctors advertised cures, but there weren't any detox centers or treatment centers, just peddlers of elixirs and potions of liquid cocaine and similar preparations. Today, new treatment centers spring up all over the world. They offer treatment for alcohol, for drugs, every form of addiction, including sex, pornography, eating disorders, and mental health issues. These advances in treatment show that alcoholism and addiction have become acceptable diseases and not an indictment of character for its sufferers. In those early days, there were very few people that had ever read this book called The 12 Steps. The early AA groups typically shared the message of hope by taking another alcoholic through the 12 steps in 1 to 2 days with 4 to 5 one-hour sessions. And most of the time they would require that all newcomers complete all 12 steps before introducing them to a regular meeting. Alcoholics Anonymous was the first time that I faced my own addictions and mental health issues. I remember attending my first meeting and have read this book for the first time, and it was confusing. I think I was like a deer in the headlights, full of fear. I was overwhelmed because I had never been through anything like the 12 steps before. Today, I often wonder what it might be like for people attending their first meeting of AA or Narcotics Anonymous if they had already completed all 12 steps before attending their first meeting, if they had already made prayer and meditation a daily part of their lives, if they had already had a genuine connection to a higher power, God. During the 1940s, the AA program experienced a huge success rate of around 75 to 80% of all newcomers who came in remained free and sober. Today, that number is much, much lower. Published studies show today that the success rate is somewhere between 5 and 10%, maybe as low as 2 to 3% depending on which state you live in. Okay, for the duration of this series, I'm going to be referring to the 12 steps as they were written in Alcoholics Anonymous. It was designed to lead to a spiritual awakening and a change in the way that we think. I would prefer to call them proposals, suggestions, or experiences because the word steps kind of sounds like a test that you must take and pass it to find sobriety or freedom. However, for simplicity, I'm going to use the word steps as it's simpler, but it's not about a pass or a fail. Instead, I'd like to encourage you to think of the 12 steps as an experience that you and I will have together, just like a mentor did with me and just like they did in the 1940s. Now, I want to be clear, this approach may not reflect AA as you know it today. This series is a guide that will help you understand the simplistic principles that were taught in the 1930s by the founding fathers of the program they called Alcoholics Anonymous, and the principles that had tremendous power and tremendous success. Also, please understand that this series is not just about alcoholism or addiction. We're going to be talking about alcoholism and addiction in general. However, these principles can be applied to every addiction or mental illness that there is. They can be applied to overcome just about every problem in your life, like eating disorders, smoking, sexual addictions, pornography, anxiety, depression, chronic pain, mental disorders, even personal relationship issues. Every troubling issue in your life can be overcome through the promises found within these steps and through the principles found within their power. The spiritual principles of the 12 steps as they were taught in the 1940s and 50s have worked for countless men and women who have found sobriety in their teachings. It worked for me, it worked for the mentors who taught me these principles, and it's going to work for you too. Why fix something that isn't broken? And why change something that works? Before going through these steps with the mentor who took this original approach with me, I'd been to 7 different treatment programs without success, and each one of them with the same result. I would leave and I would always drink or use the same day. Nothing changed. Nothing stopped me from drinking and using drugs, not even jail. Until one day a mentor took me through these 12 steps, just as they were taught in the 1940s. Doing this work and doing the steps freed me from the compulsions and the cravings to use drugs and alcohol. Now, I don't wish this series to be interpreted as a guidebook for Alcoholics Anonymous. No, nor do I want to stand here on my soapbox and tell you that there's only one way to do this. But I do have a strong opinion that there's only one true path to sobriety, and it's a spiritual one. Whatever that means to you, whatever you call it. But I'm certainly not here to argue or debate. I'm just simply here to tell you that if you approach these 12 steps with an open mind and an open heart, you're going to experience something you've never experienced in your life. You're going to discover some things about yourself that you probably didn't even know. So get a highlighter. We're going to be going over a lot of stuff as we begin. Just to be clear, you cannot go through these steps too quickly. You can, however, go through them too slowly. Why? Because the promises that are found within them, the statements of hope, will lead to a spiritual awakening that will cause a psychic change or a change in the way that we think. These steps have real power, my friends. And if you're sick like I was and you're here, then you need the power found within these steps, and you need it right now. Many times in my journey to sobriety, I heard things like, "Hey buddy, you're too close or you're too early to sobriety to do anything except your first step. The fourth step and the fifth step are the hardest ones that you'll ever have to do in your life. It's going to take you a long time to get through these steps, maybe years. Hey, you shouldn't be working on that fourth step or the fifth step for 6 to 12 months. You shouldn't mentor anyone unless you've had at least a year of continuous sobriety. And the only way that you're ever going to stay sober is if you get a big book, you get a mentor, and you go to an AA meeting every day and you ask God to keep you sober one day at a time." Are you kidding me? There wouldn't be any way for me to stay sober if I thought that the only way I could is to attend a meeting every day. If I had to call a mentor every single day to get instructions on what I should do next, gee, if I had to ask God to keep me sober just today, one day at a time, are you kidding me? What about asking God to keep me sober for the rest of my life? Well, I couldn't live this kind of existence. I'd be drinking before the sun went down to get through a day like that. As I said before, you may have already been through the 12 steps, and you may be working on them again, or you just can't stay sober. Or maybe if you're like me and you're a chronic relapser, you can relate to that. You need the promises that are found within these 12 steps, and you need them right now. As I described earlier, the pioneers of the fundamentals of this program, Bill W., was only a few days sober when he shared this message of hope with someone else for the first time. And he typically took people through the 12 steps in as little as 2 days. Just imagine what would have happened to old Bill's program if he would have waited for 6 months to a year. Alcoholics Anonymous wouldn't have gone anywhere. I'd like to give you a few words on mentorship. Early on, I met a man named Big John. He was 6'5", and he weighed about 300 pounds of solid muscle. I don't think I had ever been around a larger man in my entire life. And I will never forget the first time I met John. He walked into an AA meeting and he ducked under the door coming in. He didn't even sit down before he commanded with this big booming voice, "My name is John and I'm a real alcoholic." I did my first step serving 21 years at San Quentin Penitentiary, and any of you guys think that you've got it worse than me, come see me after the meeting and I'll explain a few things to you. After his dramatic entrance and his announcement, he sat down right in front of me at the table and stared straight through me with the coldest, steely red eyes I had ever seen in my life. He looked a lot like that brawny towel guy with his arms folded. The guy was spooky, and I was impressed. So when John got up to go to the bathroom, I turned to the friend of mine that was sitting next to me and I said, "That's my guy. He's going to be my mentor." And my friend said, "That's not a good idea. Old John, he's pretty rough around the edges," he said. Well, I said, "He's not going to get my goat." And my friend said, "Really? I think he just rode in on your goat." So after the meeting, I approached John and I asked him if he'd help me. And he asked me if I'd ever been through the first step. And I said yes. And in fact, I told him I've been through all 12 steps a few times. And he asked me a question. He said, "How have you managed to stay sober if you've been through all these steps?" And I told him, "Well, I've slipped up a few times." And he said, "You know what? There's no such thing as a slip up, brother. There's only a conscious, well thought out decision to drink or use." Then John did something that blew me away. Something no one had done with me before. Grabbed my big book out of my hand, opened it up to page 59, handed it back to me. He said, "Read the first step in first person, in your own words." And I read, "I admit that I'm powerless over alcohol, that my life has become unmanageable." He said, "You know, what does that mean to you?" And I said, "Well, powerless. It means when I have a drink of alcohol or I use a drug or I crave more, I just can't stop. I'm out of control no matter what. I can't stop. He said, you know what? You couldn't be more wrong about that. He said, you told me you've been through the first step. And when I asked you how you've managed to stay sober, you said I've slipped a few times. He said, the key words here, Cord, are the ones that you skipped over. Powerless, unmanageable. If you're managing to stay sober one day at a time and having periods of sobriety just to have a relapse and start over again, if you're one of those guys that thinks God isn't real or he can't hear you, if you're continuing to relapse over and over and over again, then you haven't completed the first step, as you told me, and you certainly haven't been through all 12 steps. You don't recognize that you have no power. You don't concede to that the alcohol and the drugs are managing you, that your life is really just a big old three-ring shit show. Does that sound familiar to you? Wow, was that me? My life was a complete disaster, an unmanageable blob of chaos. I was going through life like a big old wrecking ball, just bouncing and smashing my way from one disaster to the next, just obliterating every opportunity, every relationships, and I certainly couldn't get out of my own way. I think that John was the first guy that really helped me truly understand what I was dealing with, that my issue was a disease, a form of mental illness, and a thinking issue. I'm grateful to John for the advice that he's given me over the years, for others like him that I've worked with. I consider them my friends and my mentors today. I often call on them to have discussions and insight and issues that's going on in my own life or with somebody else that I'm working with. This is what this process is all about. The process is one alcoholic working with another. God shows up, recovery happens. One day I met a guy who knew the process and these steps better than anyone that I had ever met. I assumed that he had studied them cold for years, that he had read every book on the subject, or that he had taught workshops, that he attended every 12-step meeting that he ever could find, and that he had more knowledge than anyone that I had ever met. I quickly realized that this man had clearly had a spiritual awakening and that his thinking had changed. He clearly had recovered from the disease of addiction. And so I asked him, how did you acquire such a vast knowledge of the 12 steps? Was it because of your spiritual awakening or through the change in the way that you think? And he said, nope. I had a mentor that took me through these steps the same way that they did in the 1940s. He said, you know what? There's only one true path to sobriety, my friend, and it's a spiritual one. One that creates a psychic change in your mind or the change in the way that you think. Over time, people have come up with their own interpretation of the meetings and the 12 steps, especially with men. Men develop a godlike complex of their own versions of the 12 steps and how they should be taught. I've heard things like, maybe we should have a 13th step. But why change something that's so simple? Why fix something that isn't broken? Why change something that works, right? There is great importance in doing these steps and these things exactly the way it was done in the 1940s and 50s by great men like Bill W. and Dr. Bob and Ebby T. and the early pioneers of the AA movement, because within these 12 steps there are specific promises to be gained that will take you to a life of freedom from addiction. There's power to be found within these steps that will set you free. You see, I came into sobriety like many, kicking and screaming. I came with a big ego, and I thought I was smarter than everyone else. I was better than you, and I was convinced that I wasn't an alcoholic or an addict like you. I was the guy walking in late to every meeting that I ever went to, just to make sure that you knew that I had arrived. I was the one sitting in the back of the meeting, usually leaving early to make sure that you knew that I really didn't need to be here. I was the one pushing all my views on everyone at the meeting about the 12 steps and what they were about. I had a lot of opinions, and I wanted you to hear every single one of them. I had it all figured out. I didn't need anyone's help, especially yours. I was the guy in the meeting that was standing on my soapbox every chance I had to share my pontification about experiences that I had never had in my life because I hadn't completed these steps myself. I was the guy telling you someone else's experiences, something that I had heard in another meeting. I had opinions on the steps that were better than everyone else's because I thought I was smarter than you. And I didn't need a mentor, and I didn't need to do the work that these steps required of me. I had my whole life under control. The only time I ever had any ounce of humility was on those days that I had to crawl to the front of a room with my head held down and pick up another 24-hour chip and a hug after a huge relapse. But as soon as I would hear the words from all of you and the applause for my stupidity and have you say, "Way to go, Cord, atta boy," I was right back to the same old egotistical, narcissistic me, and I would do it all over again. Yeah, I know the 12 steps. I've had a spiritual awakening. I know the 4th step. Just ask me. I'll tell you all about it. I know God. I know Him. You want my opinion? Well, don't worry. Maybe I'm going to give it to you anyway. Then I'd relapse a few weeks later and I'd start the whole process over again. I was hopelessly pathetic. You see, there were times and periods before I got sober that I didn't have a home. I didn't have a job. I lost everything. I was living on the streets. I didn't have a car. I was in hotel rooms, panhandling. I didn't have anything. I did everything and anything that I had to survive. I begged. I got enough money for a bottle and a night in a hotel. No one wanted to be anywhere near me. I was like a lightning rod for bad luck. And I couldn't relate to any one of those people in those 12-step meetings. I was nothing like them. The point is that because of the 12 steps and the power and the promises found within them, my life began to change, just like yours is going to. For the purpose of this series, I'm going to be referring to alcoholism because primarily that's who I am. I'm a grateful, fully recovered alcoholic addict. However, in my opinion, the 12 steps apply to every addiction and can be used in daily life as a method to overcome just about anything that's messing up your life. I've used the 12-step process to help me through personal relationships, through depression, through mental illness, even smoking. Gee, for 25 years I smoked cigarettes. Someone once told me, "You know what, the cigarette's doing the smoking. You're just the sucker standing behind it." That's true. I never really understood why I smoked, except I loved to smoke cigarettes. I loved it. I hated the smell. I hated the hassle of finding a place to smoke and the cost of it, but I loved to smoke a cigarette. There's still one issue that I have. I've got a little problem with chocolate. We'll save that for later. The point is that you can use these steps to overcome just about anything in your life once you understand them. I personally believe that these steps must have been divinely given to the authors because there's a simple, proven plan of action that's found within them that will set you free. The promises and the power found within them will free you from addiction, free you from the struggles that you go through in your life on this earth. If you complete these 12 steps as they're outlined in the following series, I promise you that you will find serenity, you'll find freedom, you'll find peace, as millions and millions of men and women have done before you. I believe that all addictions are a disease and a form of mental disorder. I repeat, doesn't matter whether you suffer from addiction to alcohol, anxiety, depression, gambling, adrenaline, cigarettes, compulsive hoarding. They're all addictive mental disorders and behaviors that could be cured through these 12 steps. Thank you for spending some time with me today as we introduce the series of the 15 promises. We'll start with step 1 in the next series. Until we meet again, stay safe, stay sober, and God bless.
Are we only half alive? Embers drifting in the night, looking, wandering all the time. We seek a kingdom. This is not my home. This skin and bone. The daylight will reconcile the dead and the gone. Let the king